quick warning, regardless of how I feel about this film, I have to give it credit for the fact that it introduced me, a young 10, 12-year-old me, to Kat Dennings.
You got to work with Kat Dennings. Kat Dennings. Kat Dennings.
Thor. This was the third MCU movie I skipped in the theaters. I didn't see Iron Man 2 or Hulk because, well, I didn't like 2003 Hulk, and I skipped Iron Man 2 because it was getting a ton of mixed reviews, especially considering how well received the first one was. It didn't really spell well for the rest of the MCU, so I pulled back a little bit. You guys also have to remember there were tons of other franchises that were releasing at the same time as the MCU. Things like Harry Potter, the X-Men franchise, and Sony was trying to get their own thing started with Spider-Man, and just various other entities in the nerd film science fiction realm that were taking up my attention span over what I thought of just mediocre Marvel movies. And to be honest with you, Thor was always a character I never really connected with and I always thought was lame. Even in Marvel Ultimate Alliance, one of my favorite games of all time, he was the first character I would swap out of the starting four. However, when we got to this movie, specifically for my retro redux, I think I've softened up a bit, not only on Thor, considering how well he's been developed throughout the rest of the MCU, but I think in general this movie is much better than I originally gave it credit for. Now, that doesn't mean I love this movie or really like this movie, it just means objectively I think this movie is way better than I thought it was. I used to think this movie was trash, better than the second one, but still not that good of an MCU movie, but in fact I was wrong. Now let's get into the plot of this movie. The brash and arrogant Thor is banished from Asgard without his godlike abilities or the ability to lift his magical hammer. He's banished by his father Odin down to Earth, or what the Asgardians will call Midgard, after he led a misguided attack against Jotunheim, another realm that Asgardians previously had issues with but have come to a treaty of some sort. Now, the banished Thor must connect with Jane Foster and her group of scientists to not only discover how to get back home, but maybe learn how to connect with lesser beings and understand maybe there really is no such thing as lesser beings, but just people who are physically weaker than him. All the while, Thor's younger brother Loki manipulates the entire situation behind the scenes for his own personal gain and ego. Now, that plot in of itself is actually pretty simple, pretty decent, and I gotta give the film credit because it introduces the true fantasy and other fantastical elements to the MCU. Obviously, we had ridiculous things such as giant metallic robot suits battling in the streets, or a dude that has the ability to mutate into a giant green creature and fuck shit up. Or even in the sequel to Iron Man, a dude create a bunch of mechanical electromagnetic whips that couldn't fuck up the giant robot metal suits that people were making. However, it's supremely odd to me that out of the 4 MCU films that we've reacted to up until this point, this film, second only to Iron Man, does a great job at managing the tone as well as introducing all of these concepts in a way that feels very grounded and in line with the first Iron Man. Now, I know what you're saying. How does a bunch of stuff with people, aliens that are represented as gods from another planet with a magical hammer and lightning abilities and frost giants and things of that nature, handled realistically in a tonal sense? And it's not the fact that they're realistic, it's just more so the tone remains consistent in terms of the visuals as well as the line delivery and the story that's happening. A lot of people complain about the Thor movies getting way too comedic over time, and I would concede to that point, especially when it comes to Thor Love and Thunder.
Bro, I'm really about to get your pickle chin that boy. Hey, go that concrete here that boy. Oh, hit that boy, yo, dirt that boy, stink ass.
However, by the time we get to Ragnarok, a lot of people feel as though that there were too many jokes in that movie and it wasn't really taking itself that seriously. And I would have to disagree. I think the math of humor to drama in this film is way closer than people would like to admit. There's pretty much a joke almost at the end of every scene, and I think the reason why people don't realize that is because of the way that this film is shot versus Thor Ragnarok. Thor Ragnarok is bright, vivid, and there's definitely more of a focus on the comedic delivery of those lines that are presented in that movie. However, here, you'd be hard-pressed to find a scene that doesn't have at least a joke, a punchline, or a scene that isn't ended with a pun of some kind. It happens all the time. This movie is incredibly comedic. It's like, I would say the ratio of comedy to drama is probably 40-60, and then that switches by the time we get to Thor Ragnarok to 60-40 humor versus drama. Outside of that, let's get into the characters. Let's talk about Thor. We just gotta get this out of the way. Before I even get into the character, his development, his arc, and things of that nature, we gotta talk about them eyebrows. Why did they dye his eyebrows for this movie? It almost makes him inhuman looking in a sense. I know there are people who look like this, and I'm glad they fixed it by the time we got to the Avengers movie. You get used to it by the time we get to like halfway through the movie, but still it's just like, whoa, why are his eyebrows the same color as his hair? Honestly, Thor is just a sadistic rebel maniac reveling in killing frost giants and nearly letting his brother and friends die. But over time, this fish out of water story that they present with this character once he ends up on Earth with Jane and her team of scientists is very entertaining and honestly way more engaging than anything we got in Iron Man 2.
Yes, I want my bird.
Thor is a lot of fun, but his characterization honestly is more like Bruce Banner's than it is Tony Stark. He's portrayed more with a shallow characterization and less motivation and relatability than Tony Stark was, but he's more charismatic than Bruce, so it alleviates that feeling of you not really understanding or connecting with this character the way that the film, I guess, wants you to. And I do really appreciate how subtle and understated his arc is compared to both Bruce and Tony. This is a character going through a major shift, a major change in his perspective, and because of that, it isn't just something that's splashed in his face or thrown in the audience's face. It is delivered through glances, looks, moments where he bonds with other characters and conversations, and moments of crises where he is humbled completely that I actually really enjoyed. I do believe that Chris Hemsworth does a great job at balancing the drama in this film, but also it is clear that Chris Hemsworth is fucking hilarious by how many times he'll make you laugh in this movie without a joke being the primary source of entertainment in those scenes. Next up, we get Loki, and Loki's story here is probably the least interesting that has been presented in the entire MCU. However, the amount of intrigue that his character is given due to his portrayal from Tom Hiddleston enthralls you, and it makes the plot points even more impactful that he's faced with when you understand his entire arc and you know where he ends up at. Like, seriously, when you listen to certain lines that characters tell Loki, you begin to understand that Loki means way more to the overall thematic elements of the MCU than this film or even the Avengers or any of his other subsequent appearances outside of Loki really shove in your face and make you understand that, oh, this story is actually about Loki just as much as it is about Thor, which is very interesting and something I didn't really appreciate the first time I saw this movie. And then we get to the humans in this movie, the characters that aren't Asgardians or superpowered or villains or anything like that. And to be honest with you, I have to give this film credit because the ratio of screen time that the non-cool human characters get versus cool characters with abilities, powers, and lore get would make the Transformers movies cry, because for some reason they chose the humans over cool giant fucking robots. Here, the amount of time that the humans get just supplement the characters with abilities like Thor enough to where you connect with these characters, but they don't overstay their welcome and they don't annoy the shit out of you. I think Natalie Portman does a pretty decent job at being the love interest, and I think that Jane Foster and Thor's relationship is pretty cute or whatever. I do like Dr. Eric Selvig and how they set him up in the post-credit scene, but I also really enjoyed his drinking moment with Thor. I thought that was a ton of fun to watch. And of course, Darcy, portrayed by Kat Dennings, and really she could do no wrong. She has my heart. I will kill anyone who says otherwise. We also have Sith and the Warriors 3, and they suck. They do nothing for pretty much the entire trilogy, and I completely understand why they are killed off nonchalantly in Ragnarok, and Sith never comes back until Love and Thunder and Loki. they're kind of useless and worthless, and they don't really do much to add to Thor's character in this movie, and I'm pretty sure I would feel the same way in its sequels when I get to them in the retro redux. And finally, we have Laufey, who is, I guess, the physical antagonistic force of the film, aka the Night King, because what the fuck, this is literally the Night King. And to be honest, there really isn't much to say about this character other than the fact he roasts the absolute fuck out of Thor when he's introduced.
You know not what your actions would unleash. I do. Go now, while I still allow it. Run back home, little princess.
And finally, when it comes to the cast and the characters, I just have to talk about Anthony Hopkins. Anthony Hopkins carries this film by himself with this performance. That's not to say Chris Hemsworth and Tom Hiddleston don't do a phenomenal job as those characters. They do. But Anthony Hopkins is kind of in the wrong movie, in a good way. I think he's acting circles around everyone in this film. He does an amazing job as Odin, and despite the fact that he looks like a fucking Power Ranger, I love him in this movie. The growls and delivery of disappointment, and of course his death by heartbreak scene with Loki are great, and he just elevates this film with everything that he does in it. Now, when we get to the connections to the grander MCU, unlike Iron Man 2, I felt like the expansion of the MCU with his uses of S.H.I.E.L.D. and characters like Hawkeye, Agent Coulson, and Agent Sitwell felt a bit more natural to the story, considering whole point of S.H.I.E.L.D. being in the situation with Thor is a reaction to an event, as opposed to how they're portrayed in Iron Man 2, which is just this safety net type deal for the Tony Stark character and pretty much enable him to solve all of the issues in the film without him actually having to go through it and learn himself. These characters, as well as S.H.I.E.L.D., are here to supplement the grander universe in a way that also supplements the film and its plot, which I really enjoy. Maybe I would have given more of a role to Hawkeye when I was younger in a parallel sense to Black Widow in Iron Man 2, but now that I'm older, I think a slightly larger reoccurring role would have been better as opposed to him being a main character. It would just like overstuffed or overfluff the film for no reason. I'm not saying that his appearance here is bad, but maybe just a little bit more of something to show you why Hawkeye should be an Avenger, part of that team in a subtle way, the same way they dealt with Black Widow in the previous movie. But I'm fine with how he was presented here. I just wish there was just a little bit more. So it's not really a knock against the movie at all to me. It's just maybe something I would have changed on that end. And I also feel like the after credit scene here is way more in line with something like Iron Man 1's after credit scene than Incredible Hulk or Iron Man 2, since I feel like this actually hints to an actual overarching plot, whereas Hulk and Iron Man 2's after credit scenes were just a little confusing and too much of a tease. This is actually hinting towards something else growing in the background, which I actually really enjoyed. However, there's one thing that I do have to give this film a serious knock for, and it is the fact that I brought up in my previous video how there are a bunch of Marvel movies where it'll be the final battle, a huge CGI battle in a cool location, but the fight is lame, or the opponent is just a mirror of the main character, or it doesn't make sense, yada yada yada. And I gave you a list of all the films that did that. This film doesn't apply to that, but that's not a good thing because the final fight is so lame. It's probably the reason why I can't say I'm a huge fan of this film, or just a fan of this film period. There's so many things I love about this film when it comes to like the interpersonal relationships between Loki and Thor, Loki and his father, Thor and his father, Thor and Jane, Thor and Jane's team. But the final fight is so lame and so cliche, and honestly just feels like a Disney Channel production in my opinion, so that just brings it down a huge notch. It doesn't even fit into the cool location thing. It doesn't work. It's not something that really contrasts against Thor's, fantastical abilities or anything like that enough for me to say, oh, that at least it was in a cool location. None of that. Sorry. And all in all, I think the biggest negative for this movie when it comes to how it was made, the editing and stuff like that, I am really not a fan of the bad fake war scenes at the beginning of the film with the Night King and Odin in the flashbacks. But otherwise, it looks really good and has a very unique art style compared to its contemporaries in phase 1 of the MCU, as well as other comic book movies. I really do like the unique art style, but the only thing that holds it back from me loving it is the lighting in those scenes. It's very dark, very, underplayed overplayed, focusing on the shadows and the negative aspect of the images that we're seeing. But it makes sense considering the budget that, you know, Marvel and Marvel Studios had at the time when it came to producing these movies. And it's a Thor movie. There really wasn't that much of a guarantee that this film would have been successful or well received, considering how goofy it is innately. But everything comes together in a pretty smooth way when you consider this is really Marvel's first entry into this fantastical field. Without this film, we probably, or I should say definitively, don't get better films in the MCU like the Guardians trilogy or Thor Ragnarok, where we get to see aspects of space and the fantastical elements of this universe in a broader, brighter, and more prominent sense. All in all, this movie isn't bad. It's far from a bad movie. It's just not necessarily my cup of tea in terms of what I consider to be my favorite movies, but I do think this film counts towards being not bad, which means we so far have two not bad, and you know, Iron Man 1 is, I think, a great movie, but two not bad MCU movies in phase 1 and two bad movies in the MCU phase 1. So hopefully by the time we get to Captain America and the Avengers, the rest of this phase is smooth sailing. No! But all in all, what do y'all think about Thor? Is it one of your favorite MCU movies? Let me know why. Do you agree with me, or do you think it's an awful MCU movie? And please let me know why. And I will see y'all in the next Retro Redux. Bye bye.